What's up, guys? John Beaupre, aka Casino Crime here. Weekly video teaching you guys how to make more money playing the 4-card game. Looking forward to today. Frankly, I had really no idea what I was gonna record until, I don't know, immediately before, but been playing a decent amount of live poker lately. I am leaving for the World Series tomorrow. I'm actually closing on a home. Otherwise, I would be there earlier to play the Colossus. But I'm going to be able to play the final 2 flights and several other tournaments during the series, including the 25K PLO, 10K PLO, 3K PLO, main event, of course, and a few other no-limit tournaments, I guess. My dream is to final table one of the PLO events. I've actually never cashed in a WSOP PLO event, although I've played a bunch of them. They kind of got the best of me there. But I am looking forward to changing that this year. I feel like my PLO game has improved a lot live. And a cool video that I'm thinking about doing is where I save some hand histories from the World Series this summer. Both cash games, which will be mostly 10 and a quarter and 25.50, as well as tournament hands that we can talk about. If anyone knows of a good live hand replayer, or if they have any input on how they'd like to hear these live hands, I'm all ears. So I kind of looked through some of my old hands today and filtered for turn barreling situations, or just in general, like spots where I was like betting where I was firing a second barrel. And I included a couple of others that you'll see where I actually donkled the turn that we can talk about. In general, like, I just thought that it would be fun to talk about the turn. You know, I think that for a lot of you guys who are playing low and mid stakes, whether or not to fire a second barrel can be tricky. And what I did was try to include several situations that I think are common in both single raised and re-raised pots. So you guys can get a better feel for kind of the thought process and the logic behind whether to fire another barrel or not. And in pretty much, or I should say just like many other cases in PLO, there's a lot of thought that goes into it. So it's important to pay attention, take notes, and discuss in the forums. Let's fire away. So here we've got a limper from a very weak player. We pot from the cutoff with 10s and 4s double suited, and he calls. So we've got bottom set on 9-7-4 two-tone. You know, this is like an extremely dynamic board. You know, we have bottom set, which is nice, certainly ahead of a range, but we can't, it's difficult for us to improve, I guess, because, you know, the 10 makes a straight. That's not guaranteed to be good. So we can fill up, of course, but it's pretty easy, or, you know, not totally unlikely that he has 9-7 and maybe our 9 and 7 outs aren't clean. Regardless, like, this is a spot that I would never really check back. If we were in position and we were facing a c-bet, this would be a hand that I would always call. Can't really think of a situation that I would jam it in unless we were particularly, if we had shallower stacks. So we do c-bet. Looks like I bombed it because, again, like, this guy's just a loose passive and bad player. So we want to start putting some money in there. And he calls. Turns an ace of diamonds, and he checks. So the reason I included this hand was for several reasons. First being a lot of new players and a variety of players, I guess, kind of shut down when the turn fills the flush. And this is a good example of what's called a static turn. A static turn is one in which if someone has the nuts, there are few hands that have the nuts against them. So good examples of static turns are when turns pair the board, or when the turn is a flush filling card like this. So it's much different, you can imagine, than like what would be maybe like if the turn was like a queen of spades, that would be a very dynamic turn. The board would become very dynamic. But this is a good example of a static turn. Now on static turns, you'll notice that especially at the low stakes, people play pretty straightforwardly if they started the flop out with a draw that didn't fill. So what I'm getting at is most players, if they have like 6-8, 10 jack, you know, 5-6-8, 3-5-6 type hands, which are certainly in someone's range that's this loose, they're going to just fold those now. And, our set, it's certainly doing well against the non-flush parts of our opponent's range. What's more important here is that we want to make him fold the parts of his range that do have equity against us, which should be a decent amount of his range. But what we don't want to do is bet too large to where we only get called by flushes. So you'll see here that I actually chose a pretty small sizing. I chose a little over third pot. And I kind of like this sizing, actually. It's unconventional. I think this is smaller than I would normally go. Typically, when I fire a second barrel on this type of turn texture, I would make it closer to half pot. But I kind of like this turn because I keep in a lot of hands that are a lot worse than ours. So let's say if I have or let's say that he has like a 2-pair type hand. Somehow he has like ace-9. Or somehow he has like top 2. It's kind of nice because those hands will make crying calls against us. But hands like straight draws, the 8-10 jacks of the world, the 6-8-10s and stuff like that, a lot of those hands are just going to fold now, which is nice. So here it's nice to pick this sizing because we kind of prevent ourselves from getting bluffed on the river. We charge, albeit a small price, we charge at least something against the hands that are still drawing against us, and we can even get value from worse. And in general, what I tell my students is that as a default, I pretty much, if I've bet the flop, I typically I have a very, very high barreling frequency on these types of turns, which are called static turns. So he does call, and the river's a deuce. Goes check, check, and we win against 7-8-10 jack. So I think that, I said that a lot of draws would actually fold the turn. I think a lot of people would fold a hand like that, but perhaps it's like a function of my sizing, and also I'm sure some of it has to do with him being a very loose passive player. He decided not to fold. But I thought that, the option that I picked was infinitely better than checking or bombing it. So I thought that was kind of a cool hand. And also, it's important to include that hand because of the textures more than anything. Recognizing the difference between a dynamic and a static turn is very important to profitable turn play. Okay, so I don't remember so much about this hand, but let's talk about it anyway. So standard so far, kind of a slightly over half stacker, weaker player, kind of maybe like tight passive. It's been 40 hands. He hasn't 3-bet yet. I guess I haven't 3-bet either, but I would imagine just by like glancing at his HUD that he's probably not a great player. So 3-bet and he calls. Flop comes 10-3-5. 2 spades, 1 diamond, overpair, backdoor flush draw. Not bad. Certainly, like on this texture, I'd just be looking to like pot and get it in. I hope that's what I do. Yep, I pot it. And the reason for that is just because I kind of want him to fold if he has like a 10 inside cards. Some people will even fold a hand as strong as like a pair and a gutter here. You never know. And I think that just like this is a light enough. It's light enough on his range that maybe he'll get it in bad sometimes. And I just kind of want to take it down. I think that if we were deeper, I wouldn't pot it, but given what stacks are, I think that potting it is the best option. If we were deeper, I certainly wouldn't pot it. If we had like started the hand with 100 big blinds, I would choose a smaller sizing. So we pot it and he actually calls. And so the reason that I'm including this hand is to point out a very noticeable tendency amongst almost all players. It's different sometimes as you get to the higher stakes, and players can hand read and become trickier. But, when people check call on these textures, their range is extremely light in flush draws. So where a lot of players I see will check back this turn in fear of running into a flush, it's actually very unlikely that we run into a flush because many flush draws would have just jammed on the flop. So you'll notice that I bet extremely small. Kind of my thinking here was that I was going to set up potentially a river jam. I really didn't want to bet like half pot and then fold. I wasn't sure. Like sometimes he might have a flush because I potted the flop, so maybe he just thinks that I look strong and he wants to like check call and see a flush on the turn. But again, like more than anything, what I wanted to point out was the major. He ends up folding, by the way. The major difference between like people's ranges when they check raise and when they just check call on these types of flops. All right, I thought this was a pretty interesting hand, and to be honest, I'm not totally sure about my line, but we can talk about it. So we open for pot with ace 6-5 with a suit, get called by the button. Both blinds fold. It comes jack 7-3 rainbow, which I think is a pretty interesting situation given the SPR. Typically in a single raised pot when I open and get called by someone, I like to think about how they perceive the board and how likely it is they are to fold to c-bets. Of course, everyone has a different fold to c-bet percentage, but this guy's like an aggressive regular. We have a decent amount of history. These are the boards that regs just kind of don't give up on. So I would imagine that if I c-bet here, I'm getting called 80% of the time, perhaps. And maybe that's a little bit of of a stretch, but I really do believe it's an extremely high percentage. On these are the types of boards that regs most commonly float with like really anything. It's a board that's a lot heavier in the buttons range anyway. So we can expect to get called a lot. So, in general, as I've said in other videos, I like to take unconventional lines that don't put me in tough situations out of position with awkward SPRs against good players. And so I think like although against many players I would c-bet this hand, for example, like I don't know. Let's see. Well, nobody really at this table, but like as a default, like if I didn't have any reads on someone, I think that I would c-bet this. But since I know this guy's like a reg and he's capable of floating, my goal in this hand was to keep the pot small and play it as a 2-street game if I could, maybe even a 1-street game, depending on the run out, and check call and evaluate some turns, which is what I do here. And you can expect, like, of course, he's going to stab here extremely wide with, like, any pair and side cards. Of course, his nutted hands, like sets and stuff like that. But I do think that his stabbing range is extremely wide. But that being said, we're too deep to check raise. And our hand is too good to fold. So I kind of preferred, like, check calling and keeping his range wide, because I think that his betting range when check two is wider than his c-bet calling range. So it's kind of nice because I keep his range wide by taking this line, and I guarantee myself to play a smaller pot. So the turn is a queen of diamonds, and in the hand I decided to lead, which I think is pretty non-standard. I mean, in fact, I think it's extremely non-standard. I don't really see many players taking this line. But at the time, I thought it was a good play. I thought it was a turn that was better for my range than it was for his. And I also thought it was nice for me because I can kind of put the nuts back in my range. When I check call this flop, it's really difficult for me to have a strong hand. But now by leading the turn, I think I kind of put some of those, good two pairs, monster draws back in my range, which is good. And it's going to force him to play more straightforwardly on the river, which I want. The thing that I feared the most was like, him barreling the turn and then me getting bluffed off the best hand on some runouts. And I think that what this does is it's really difficult for him for if you're in his shoes, for example, it's a pretty expensive jam if he wants to just like go all in with like a pair and a flush draw, for example. It's a lot easier for him to just call and play rivers rather than it is to, well, I just think that most people are just going to call. They're much more likely to call here than they are to jam. And in that same breath, I think that it also makes people play more straightforwardly on the river when I want to check and get the showdown. because they're afraid of getting check raised because I took a very strong turn line. And as I mentioned, I think that this is also like a turn that's pretty good for my range, or it should be. But the turn and get called. The river's actually, I think, a great card for us. Goes check, check, and we win against his ace-queen. So that was a pretty interesting line. It kind of helps us recognize board textures and which cards are good for which player's range. All right, in this hand, we have ace, queen, 10, 8. In the big blind, we squeeze a button open from a loose aggressive player. He calls. We bet 28 on a queen, jack, deuce with top pair and a gutter. Double gutty, I should say. And he calls, again, like, this is a quick one, but I just wanted to highlight it to tell you not to slow down on these static turns. It's also nice when we have, there's no reason to bomb it. In general, like in both single raised pots and 3-bet pots, I choose smaller sizing on these static turns just because, like, a lot of their floats and other nonsense fold. So it really doesn't take much to balance this with, like, flushes and stuff like that. It's clear that he doesn't really, he's very unlikely to have a set or two pair. So even if we had a flush, we could easily, like, bet small, keep in hands that are, like, deadish, and jam the river. So again, like, it's nice that we can balance like that and be balanced with our sizing. All right, let's see this one. We just call a button open with ace, 5-4 with a suit. Against a lot of players, I would 3-bet this. But at this stack depth with aces that are this weak, I think calling is a good play. If I thought that the player was going to 4-bet a lot, I would 3-bet it. But this player wasn't really like that. And I think that when players are this deep, especially competent players, they kind of recognize the risk-reward of 4-betting when in position is pretty high. So they prefer to just call with most of their range. Even a lot of, like, I see players call with aces nowadays in position for deception. So I think that calling is a good play. Big blind folds. So I thought that this was an interesting hand to include because, we have a lot of, like, weird medium type stuff going on for us here. First of all, we have an overpair, right? And against a button opening range, we're going to be ahead of a range on this type of texture. It's different if we were facing, like, a middle position range. I think I'd be more likely to just check fold if we were facing, like, a middle position opening range from the same player type. But against a button open, I really don't want to fold here. We have a backdoor nut flush draw. We have the ace of spades. We have bottom pair, and we have an overpair. And I guess we have a backdoor straight draw too. So it seems kind of ridiculous and too tight to just, like, check fold. But again, like, similar to the other hand we were talking about, check raising seems like overplaying our hand. And I think that this deep, you will get more credit for having, like, strong hands in your range. So I thought that, like, if we check call, we can still rep a lot of hands out of position that we probably couldn't at other stack depths against this player. And here, I take, like, kind of a similar line that I took on the other hand where I had ace, 5, 6 and just decided to lead the turn. I thought that it was a good spot for several reasons. One being that I think that we're ahead of his range as of now, like, just from a frequency standpoint. And second, having the ace of spades is a big deal. It's a big deal for two reasons. Well, one, like, maybe it sets up some good river bluff spots for us. Okay, that's nice. Second, it really makes it extremely difficult for him to just rip it in on the turn here with a draw. Because we know he can't really have, like, the nut flush draw. Of course, like, if we happen to run into a set, he's going to just raise us and we're going to have to fold. But pretty much that's, like, all that his raising range can be in this situation is sets, given our line. And, like, as I mentioned, I think that this is a spot where we actually could have sets. It's possible. Although that I think that most players would continue barreling here, some players won't. Simply because, like, if we call the flop, like, what what are we going to fold now on the turn? And some good players will recognize that. So I thought that this was another good spot where we could like check call and lead. We're leading kind of for value, and we're also allowing ourselves to play more profitably on the river. And in general, like many, especially as you get deeper, uh, many times the purpose of a double barrel or purpose of not double barreling is setting yourself up to play profitably on the river. It's not actually just, the immediate bet. It's more about kind of jockeying for who is going to play more profitably on the river. And in this case, I thought it would benefit me a lot to have the initiative going into the river. So we bet and he called. It's actually a great river for us, I thought. And I just wanted to bet. I thought that most of his range, that's like, it seems unlikely he's going to bluff here. And thought that like I could get called pretty light here because I've taken an unconventional line. People just get confused and call sometimes. So I thought it was better to bet than to check, but he folded. Okay, this one here, we open small blind versus big blind. King Jack 10-7 with a suit. Get called by a loose player in the big. It's not really 3-betting very much, but he's certainly loose pre, and it seems passive post, just judging from his statistics. I think the flop is pretty easy c-bet. We don't have to bet very big, but in general, the common adjustment against players who are wide pre-flop is to just c-bet and barrel more. So he's going to miss this flop a decent amount, so it's good to like, I'm sure the c-bet is immediately profitable, especially since we have a gutter and a backdoor Broadway draw and a backdoor flush draw. Turn is very nice for us. It gives us more straight outs and a flush draw. Pretty easy barrel again. I mean, I typically, in single raised pots, lean towards barreling when I pick up equity. It depends a little bit on the actual board, but here, like, his range is just pretty wide for like ace and side cards, random straight draws, and he pretty much has to have exactly ace queen to raise us. So in situations where we have a lot of equity and the range that beats us is going to play passively, I prefer barreling. And he calls. So we kind of whiff everything on the river. And from what we've seen, he could easily have something. But I think that on this run out, what's more important, I think that an 8 is clearly going to call us. An ace is going to call us most of the time. Our goal here is to make his draws fold for a pretty cheap price. So I choose a smaller sizing because I think it's believable, and I think that his range is pretty inelastic in these spots. I think that I'm sure there's like a difference if we pot it, but I think that between like betting 38 and 60, it's probably pretty inelastic, so I chose a smaller bet, and it worked. So this hand, we open ace jack 7 deuce double suited from middle position, get called by a unknown player on the button. It's probably a weaker player. He bought in for less than 100 big blinds. Played a lot of hands so far. Probably a weaker player, I would guess. That would be my initial read. And a player in the big who is clearly a weak player as well calls. Flop a non-nut flush draw, and I got shot. But again, as I've said in other videos, this is my favorite spot to c-bet on heavy boards and three-way pots when we have the pre-flop initiative. This is this is pretty much the best three-betting or c-betting spot that you can come across. But the button calls, and we turn a pair with our flush draw, and I actually don't like my barrel here, and I'll tell you why. First, even though our read, if we had to make one, is that he's a weaker player, his range is pretty strong for calling with the player behind. I think that like a lot of players will actually even have like two pairs here and draws that are better than ours, like a better flush draw. So that's one reason, for being that I think that we're just beat a lot of the time. The second important reason out of three is that this is a turn that's not going to make him, anything that called the flop isn't going to fold now. So what I'm really doing here is just kind of lighting the 38 on fire, from the sense that like if he jams, I think we're going to have to fold, unfortunately. I think it's close, but I think given that we don't have enough, we have like a poor flush draw, like we can be getting it in very, very poorly here. Um, and also because we set up kind of a poor river situation for us with this sizing. I mean, if we get there with a heart, I don't know how comfortable we are value jamming it. I suppose that, like, if the river's like a club or like a straight completing card, we could probably try to bluff that. But the combination of him just having like a big range strength advantage and us kind of positioning ourselves to play poorly on the river and get exploited in one way or the other, I think makes this a check on the turn. A check and evaluate. Sometimes check call, maybe even check fold, depending on sizings and stuff like that. So I really don't like my sizing. Again, like I think that the important thing to note on this texture is that it's really anything that called the flop is going to call the turn now. So it makes our second barrel a lot less effective with this particular hand. And we river like a funky two pair and decide to check call. And I think that at the time I just thought, you know, all the draws missed. He probably would have raised me with a, you know, king two pair plus on the turn. So I kind of got to call you, but he actually ended up having a set. So nice hand to that guy. All right, in this hand we 3-bet a button open with single suited double paired aces. Get called. Flop the nut blocker, queen 10 deuce monotone. Again, like if you notice my sizing, this is another reason I included it, was just to pay attention to sizing. I'm a big sizing degen, I like to say. I really think that where a lot of the profit in poker comes from, just using good sizing better than using sizing better than your opponents, I should say. And I guess my plan here was to bet and barrel. Yeah, because we have the ace of diamonds. That's nice. But also because I think that people have a lot of floats on this board. So my intention really isn't to bet and make him, you know, like fold a flush. People don't really fold flushes in 3-bet pots for the most part. My reason for betting here is just that, like, he can have queen 10s that'll fold later on. That's what I'm really trying to make fold. You know, people have floats on this board with like a king of diamonds and an open ender, sure, like a king jack X. So it's just basically like setting up myself with the right stacks to barrel and leverage. And you can see that I'm kind of doing here with his sizing. Now, the reason that I included this hand was to talk a little bit about strategy adjustments and what my defaults are on different boards. You know, I think in this situation, like I typically will just give up once I get called on the turn. I chose a smaller sizing on the flop, both because of the board texture and because I want to keep his range wide by selecting a smaller sizing so that my turn barrel is more effective. But once you get called on this turn, I think that people are just going to get sticky and not fold the river, frankly. And I decided to check fold, even though it's like, it's weird, right? You know, like a river to set, he's kind of representing exactly a flush and, you know, exactly like a king high flush because of his bet. I remember, like, part of me really wanted to call, but I also just think that, like, he's not going to turn a set into a bluff, and it's really difficult for him to have, like, complete floats left, so I decided to make a disciplined fold. Okay, here we min open on the button with king jack jack 3 with a suit. Given how deep everyone is, I would have liked to see myself open for 3x, or even pot. You know, these guys aren't particularly 3-betty. Small blind is aggressive, I guess, but certainly because of the stacks, I would have preferred to have seen me 3x. I'm sure I was playing a bunch of tables or something and just kind of autopiloted that. Comes ace-7-5 rainbow. You know, again, like I min-opened, so his range is going to be wide. This is a board that kind of hits both of our ranges, but I think it would hit mine more. And I would check back here if I actually had something strong enough to check back. A lot of players make the mistake of like just polarizing for one street. You know, they think like if I check back, I'm going to be able to like check it down or show it down with these jacks. And although like your jacks might be good now, it's kind of difficult to show down the jacks, so I'd prefer to just like bet and take it down sometimes and look for good opportunities to barrel on the right runouts. And there's a couple of. On the other hand, I said that there's turns that won't make their flop calling range fold, and I think that this turn is a little bit different than the other one. The other one was like King Queen 5. King Queen 5 7 was the board, and this one's Ace 7 5 10. It's just a different board. Like if someone has like bottom 2, this is the turn that'll make them fold. Maybe like Ace 5 will fold now, and we picked up some equity. A gutter with the flush draw. So I think that like since his check raising range has to be so narrow, this is actually a pretty good spot to continue barreling. Great run out for our hand. I mean, we can easily represent 6-8. We can represent a backdoor Jack-8. We, of course, have Jack blockers. So it's an easy spot to just empty the clip. And we bet, and he folds. So that's nice. Kind of highlights the luxury of being in position in that situation. I included this one just to show you again like another good barreling opportunity. I 3-bet or squeezed Queen 7-8-6 double suited. And the reason I squeezed is just I really felt like the button was going to be folding a lot, and I would get heads up in position. Like this hand plays better heads up than it does multi-way. And so I thought that most of the time the button would fold, and this player in the small blind, who's kind of like a little bit too loose in my opinion, is going to call, and like I can play profitably in position against him. But as it turns out, they both call me. I flop middle pair and a gut shot and a backdoor flush draw. And this is a spot where like again like I can balance pretty easily, right? Like I kind of like choosing this sizing because it sets up profitable barreling opportunities for me later. I'm also concerned because in a re-raised pot, when it comes ace high, one player in a three-way pot is going to have an ace a very high percentage of the time. I don't know the exact percentage, but it's going to be very high percentage. And it's foolish to think that people are just that you're going to get people to fold an ace to one bet, especially a bet that this is small. So like the better plan for me, or like the main objective, is to get immediate folds when they don't have an ace. Save myself money when I get jammed on. That's important. Like if the small blind jams, I'm just going to fold. And position myself to barrel profitably on later streets, while also like kind of getting the range that beats me to play passively and allow me to like realize my own equity. Realize my own equity, I guess, while getting some fold equity. So we bet 18. Like I would have called it off against the button, of course, like if he jammed, but I would have folded if the small blind called. And again, we've talked a lot about static turns today and why they're good at barreling opportunities. I think it's pretty clear why this is a good barreling opportunity. We're representing aces. We have an 8 blocker. He could have a lot of like ace X's that'll, fold now, or like some other random straight draw type hands. So you could see like with my sizing what I'm kind of leveraging towards the river. I like this sizing too. Like typically what I do is when I'm choosing sizing and I'm trying to leverage someone's whole stack, I pick about 20% or 25% of their stack. And the same is true for no limit tournaments. Like if somebody has, let's say, 100,000 chips, I like to 3-bet them to 25K. So it leverages their whole stack. Here I picked 36 and he called. Kind of expected to get looked up here, but I jammed anyway. And he folded. Okay, and that's going to do it. Hopefully you guys learned a couple of good tips for barreling the turn and which situations are good to follow through or not. Some good stuff about sizing, some good stuff about board textures. As always, please let me know if you have any questions in the forums or in the comment section. And I'm also looking for more videos to review. So if you have any, or you'd like to see other stuff in the future, please let me know. Good luck, guys. Casino Crime signing off. See you next week. And good luck to everyone going to the World Series.